And I'm in awe, as everybody else is, and especially with my heroes, Peter Roeder and Alex Donaldson here, who are the gurus of infectious disease management. And I'm a mere practitioner in Devon. And what I'm going to introduce is a controversial issue, which is and should be a veterinary issue, but has spilled out into a political issue, an issue where everyone in the country has an opinion, and which makes life quite difficult. So I've been sort of trying to hide away in a little corner of Devon, coming up with a practical solution to deal with a problem on a specific herd and use it as a model in a larger area. So, do cows kill badgers or do badgers kill cows? Well, of course, what a ridiculous thing. Neither happens. But these two animals, photographs were taken last week, are now dead. One at the hands of a slaughterman and the other at the hands of a farmer with a shotgun. Both were legally killed. They were clinically normal, not affected in any way with any particular symptoms. The cow failed the tuberculin test, which indicated that it had been exposed to Mycobacterium bovis. It may be infected with Mycobacterium bovis. We don't know if it was infectious or shedding the disease, but it died because of the disease. The badger was killed with no idea whether it was infected, shedding, or whatever. And it was killed on the basis that it may be a risk for the transmission of the disease. And I live and work in a practice which is in the center of 3 cull zones. And we have farmers who are diligently, tonight, will be going out shooting badgers in the somewhat naive belief that this is going to solve their problem. And we in the practice are very nervous that in 3 years' time, they're going to be saying, this hasn't worked. So why do I say that? Well, this farm that we've been looking at is a significant 300-cow intensive dairy farm in East Devon. It's outside the cull zone. It's quite conveniently located from a disease management point of view because on the right-hand side, on the easterly side, it's surrounded by an old people's home called Seaton. And on the south, it is surrounded by the coast, the north, a main road, and to the left, quarries. And interestingly, and here's the connection, these buildings that we're actually in were built from stone that was quarried from the Branscombe quarries. So there is a slight little nice connection. We have dealt with infectious disease on this farm over the past 10 years to the point where it performs fantastically well. It has 300 cows producing nearly 13,000 litres. If you don't know anything about cows, that's nearly twice the national average. Milked by 5 Lely astronaut robots. They are housed 24/7. The welfare is extremely good. We do not tolerate any form of disease, but it has been locked up with tuberculosis for the past 5 years. And this is its tuberculosis testing history on the right. About 100 cows have given their lives on the basis that there's a chronic endemic infection of tuberculosis circulating within the herd. I was challenged by the farmer to deal with this, and so if we take it from a strictly veterinary point of view, dealing with an infectious disease in a fairly isolated population, it's a totally closed herd, we have to look to see where the source of those bugs are. It's not that difficult, you'd think, to find out where this mycobacterium is residing and how it is in creating these new infections. So we've got 2 options. It's either circulating within the cows, it's either circulating in the badgers, or a bit of both, and is there a transfer of disease between the 2? So we set about looking for both. We set about looking for disease or potential disease in the badgers by doing environmental sampling in partnership with Warwick University. Sean Powell, a PhD student, came down for 3 months, surveyed every badger in the farm and in the neighborhood, so we know where every badger was and where it was moving and how it was moving. And we took 273 latrine samples, badger fecal samples, from around the farm. The latrines are marked. And to our surprise, 30% of all the samples that we took were positive for Mycobacterium bovis using the RD4 qPCR test, which is reasonably sensitive. It will detect down to 1,000 organisms per gram of feces. And in fact, 70% of all the latrines had at least one positive fecal sample. So we knew that there was a significant environmental challenge to cattle that were grazing. But as you've probably spotted, none of the adult cows graze, but the young stock do. So the young animals go out to the grass, graze, and then come into the herd. And once they're in the herd, they'll stay there for the rest of their lives. So we knew that we'd got a significant challenge from the environment, from the badgers, and we knew that we'd got disease within the herd. But were those skin tests that we were using, the routine comparative skin test, which is the legal test to use in cattle, were they detecting all infections? So we moved to some novel testing programs. We had a connection with Nottingham University with phage testing, which we have been trying. My expertise, if I have any, is in the management of Johne's disease, another mycobacterial disease of cattle. And we've been using phage to detect low levels of Mycobacterium paratuberculosis. And we adapted, or Kath Rees at Nottingham adapted the test to detect Mycobacterium bovis. And sure enough, in our first round of testing, we selected a high-risk group, and we found about 40 animals that were positive on the phage test to Mycobacterium bovis in their blood. It's quite a difficult technique. These are intracellular organisms. It requires smashing the macrophages and declumping the mycobacterium and then attacking them with a specific virus which only grows in the presence of the Mycobacterium bovis DNA. And so it's an extremely sensitive test and extremely specific. And we were quite concerned that there were a group of cattle, nearly 30 of them in the first round of testing, that were positive to M. bovis on phage, which had passed skin testing. We then thought, well, that tells us that they're infected, but are they infectious? Because the mycobacteria are a fantastic disease. If you ever get a chance at the pearly gates to come back as a pathogen, I'd strongly recommend that you go for Mycobacterium. It's a great organism. It's long-lived, very difficult to deal with, and it lives mostly in perfect symbiosis with its host. So we then started testing saliva and feces to see if we could detect the organism in either of those, to see if any of these animals were shedding. We tested over 60 cattle for saliva and never found the organism in any of them, but we have found significant numbers of animals, infected cattle, which are not being detected by the skin test, which are shedding Mycobacterium bovis at more than 10 to the 3 per gram in feces, yet are retained in the herd because they are not classified as reactors. And this told us that there was an infective load going on within the herd itself. Even more interesting, we've been doing this now for nearly 2 years, and we have a policy as to what to do with those infected and infectious animals, and we are gradually reducing the infected load. The number of positives is getting less and less. But we do see this phenomenon of clustering, which is worrying us. So over half of all the phage-positive animals that are currently in the herd were born within a 3-month period back in 2011, 2012. Bearing in mind that there are 1,100 cattle on this farm, and it's a totally dynamic population, this seems more than chance. And in fact, when we look back to the history, we find the mother of one of those animals was taken as a TB reactor sometime after the calf was born. And I strongly suspect that this group of animals were all infected as young calves, either in the calving pens or in the dry cow yards or in the rearing pens, and have carried that infection latently throughout their lives. It's taken us 4 years to find them, and bear in mind that most of these animals have had over 30 skin tests during their lifetime and have passed every one of them and declared as non-reactors. 3 of them are shedding. Our deal with the farmer is that as soon as we detect shedding, we cull to remove the infected load, but this is of quite concern to us. So who infects who? Back to my original point here. Well, we've got a dynamic going on. Because what we have is undetected cattle that are shedding significant numbers of organisms into the dung, which is then put out onto the environment. And then this is, of course, the dung pack is the perfect feeding place for a wandering badger. That's where he goes to pick the grubs and the worms and whatever. And they're encountering, in my view, a large infected load, getting infected, and then becoming diseased. They then, in turn, start shedding in their feces and reinfect those pastures with their own fecal contamination. So now we have a problem where we have a disease dynamic going on within wildlife and a cat farm population, and somehow we have to break that infectious cycle. So how do we do that? Well, what choices have we got? If we are going to remove that environmental load, we have to remove, first of all, the infection and shedding from the cattle. I think I can do that using the enhanced testing program that we've got. We are gradually working that down. But we are confounded by politics, public opinion, legislation as to what we can do in the environmental load which is held within the badgers. And in my view, I will be negligent to spend this farmer's money to remove infection from his cattle, only then for him to turn his young stock out onto pastures which I know have been contaminated by infected badgers. I have to deal with that as a veterinary surgeon. So this is where we confronted the wildlife charities. Bradley's absolutely right about the need for social skills. You don't get very far in veterinary practice if you just shout louder. You have to do a bit of listening, and you have to bring people together. So we confronted a significant charity called the Save Me Trust to ask them, put the open question to them, what would you do? What would you do, Mr. May? And he came down to the farm, and this was just a huge experience. This is an intensive farm. In their words, it is a factory farm. And it was a difficult meeting to start with, but it's ended up that they have helped us with this program, and in fact, with a bit of help from me, managed to find vaccine for these badgers, and we now have engaged in a major vaccine program in conjunction with Warwick University to see if annual vaccine of these badgers will reduce the environmental load that we'll confront with the cattle. Slaughter, the other only options that we've got is to fence these badgers out, but you can see from the positioning of the latrines, that's going to be technically and economically hugely difficult and is going to disrupt badger behavior, or we could kill them all. And that's what some farmers are attempting to do. This farm is outside a cull zone. It's in an area that has applied for a license, but if we can prove that the vaccination reduces the environmental load, we will be fine. But I don't want anybody to go home and think that testing is the solution to this. It certainly isn't. This program is really only required in the relatively few cattle herds that have a chronic endemic infection which has been long-term. The current statutory testing program and control program works extremely well in most herd situations. So we have just under 5,000 cattle herds in Devon. We have the highest prevalence of TB of anywhere in England for sure. And at any one time, about 14% of our cattle herds are under TB movement restrictions, i.e. currently infected by the terms of the definition of the state. The good news is that means 86% aren't. They're not infected. But don't sit down for too long, because those 86%, this is a dynamically moving population. Those 86% of herds that aren't infected, a significant proportion of them, probably 600, will go down with the disease in the next year. And that's not a testing issue. That's a biosecurity issue. And we have to tackle that. And the farmers, the NFU, and everybody else concerned has to deal with that. Some of those new infections will be caused by cattle movements, some by badger and wildlife reservoirs. But that's the key to the overall control. Dealing with undetected reservoirs in cattle is only a problem on the larger herds with a high risk of spread, where there is endemic infection and a high contact rate. And so I don't want you all going home thinking the solution to TB is to use enhanced testing using phage and PCR. It's not. The solution to TB control is to manage and prevent new infections, but this may be a solution for those large herds where we've got chronic endemic problems. Thank you.